You know that I'm a doctor and a psychiatrist. I'm also a psychoanalytically trained psychotherapist and a wife and mother and grandmother. What you probably don't know is that I'm a lay Benedictine, and that my thinking has been influenced by the rule of St Benedict. The first word of the rule of St Benedict is listen. And that would be a strong subtext in my talk today. And my aim is to integrate both my studies and my life experience in the story I will share in the next 40 or 45 minutes. Some definitions will help to set the scene. Medicine means treatment, something prescribed or given skillfully to someone in need by an expert and not just drugs. Mercy is usually used as a noun, and in everyday life means forgiveness. It's usually seen as it's someone else's gift. And of course, mercy featured strongly in the Beatitudes, which call on us to offer unconditional gifts of love, to visit the sick and the powerless, and to reach out to marginalised people. And in Matthew's Gospel, at the start of the Sermon on the Mount, in some translations, mercy became a verb. Congratulations to the merciful, for they shall be mercied. Which to me introduces the concept of the mutuality of mercy. Mercy doesn't talk down to a disabled person, nor does the merciful person feel superior. I suggest that it is impossible to be merciful if you've not received mercy, just as we cannot love if we've not experienced love. Well, in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Act 4, Antonio, the merchant of Venice, had signed a bond granting Shylock a pound of flesh if he defaulted on his debt, which he did. When Shylock demanded to know why he must be merciful, Portia replied on behalf of Antonio that the quality of mercy is not strained or forced. Mercy is voluntary and natural rather than a legal gift, not one to be expected, but something to be surprised by. Now, in both the medical world, in our faith, and in our faith communities, we talk of healing and being healed. The title of my talk suggests mercy has something to do with healing, but not just bodily healing. Body, mind, and spirit are one, and they need to be one. Our physical, mental, and spiritual sides all work in harmony. Any dysfunction in one disturbs the others. I successfully argued this point in gaining an amendment to the Health and Social Care Act in the United Kingdom in 2012, insofar as health and illness were redefined at the beginning of the Act as physical and mental health, and physical and mental illness. Spirituality was not included in the definition, although it was called for by the Archbishop of York very strongly. But it is increasingly part of the discourse in UK healthcare. So I asked, how can doctors and nurses find the depth of mercy needed for this whole person healing? The word more used in medical circles is compassion, another much misunderstood word. It means to suffer with and to offer some help. Empathy is another concept that is sometimes confused with both mercy and compassion. And it's usually defined as walking in someone else's shoes. But if I try to walk in your shoes, I can only experience your life from my perspective and in the light of my past experiences. I can never know what it is really like to be you. On the other hand, some people are more empathic, more able to feel the pain of another. Empathy requires human contact, which connects the humanity in each person. Compassion then translates that feeling of pain, that empathy, into action. So the attentive clinician who suffers with and stays alongside the patient or the patient's partner in the clinical encounter, gut to gut, with tears in his or her eyes, is being both empathic and compassionate. These are the skills that are expected in a therapist like myself, but they're less often present in the high-tech hospitals that have grown up in the last 50 years. Now, mindfulness is sweeping through our workplaces, including in hospitals, in Parliament. Yes, something like 150 members of Parliament in the UK have done mindfulness training. In our schools, it's a secular practice with the aim of building more compassionate relationships. In mindfulness seminars, the Buddhist practice of metta has become an exercise in loving kindness. We're asked to wish someone well, the postman, the teacher, and eventually someone we find particularly difficult. For those of us familiar with the ancient tradition of Christian meditation, or with Lectio Divina, we will see many similarities. In the UK, there has been a strong focus on trying to rediscover compassion in health and social care, after some shocking inquiries that have disclosed a lack of empathy and care in too many of our caring settings. Now, Atul Gawande, in his thought-provoking book, Being Mortal, challenges us to ask why the care of frail and vulnerable people is increasingly delegated to doctors and nurses. Now, he's a surgeon, which is quite interesting, and he's come through his own clinical experience and his own experience of failing to adequately and appropriately meet the needs of dying patients, asks these questions. He said, too often the doctor at hospital are delivering their skills to keep the person alive without thinking and being with the person to find out what their own priorities are. What is your understanding of the situation and its possible outcomes? What are your fears and hopes? What trade-offs are you willing or not willing to make? And what course of action best serves this understanding? And his book is well worth reading. My own work has been to challenge similar, inappropriate medicalisation of the lives of people with intellectual disabilities. We're still dealing with the aftermath of a report by an undercover reporter into abuse and torture of patients with intellectual disabilities in a private hospital called Winterbourne View in Bristol. Similar abuses have been reported in nursing homes for very old people. And you can see some of the images taken from the film that was shown on television. It was a panorama program. Well, Compassion in Practice is a new strategy for nursing. It was published by NHS England after the Mid-Staffs Hospital inquiry. And it emphasised 6 C's: care, compassion, competence, communication, courage and commitment. And last year, the NHS developed a culture of care barometer to see how well different hospitals were doing, particularly when organisational culture change is needed. The elements in the barometer are the resources needed to deliver quality care, the support needed to do a good job, a worthwhile job that offers the chance to develop and the opportunity to improve team working. But stress in people at work is rising, and research shows that stressed staff engage less positively with their patients. Will the introduction of mindfulness for these staff improve the barometer ratings? This is one of the thoughts. Is it the organisational culture that is leading to the apparent decrease in compassionate care in recent years? You see, it's impossible for any of us to provide compassionate care if the organisation within which we work doesn't treat us compassionately too. And this doesn't just apply in hospitals. It will apply in all organisations where people are working. I want to introduce also here the idea that the carer also needs compassionate care for themselves. For people who sit with a dying family member, who suffer in their own way and at times may find that they're caring too much, the question, and what now, is asked very helpfully in this book by Ross Cupper, helping each of us to reinvent ourselves after a major loss or change in our lives. Now, Now, in his World Communications Day sermon this year, the Pope said communication has the power to build bridges, to enable encounter and inclusion, and thus to enrich society. He said how beautiful it is when people select their words and actions with care in the effort to avoid misunderstanding, to heal wounded memories, and to build peace and harmony. How we live our daily lives has a great deal to do with mercy. How we relate to the people we meet, passers-by, shopkeepers, work colleagues, customers, tells others a lot about who we are and what makes us tick. From my perspective, as a healthcare professional, the relationship between communication and mercy, or love, is the key element of compassionate care. And to me, listening is the most important element of communication. So being heard is part of the treatment, the medicine. Listening is never easy, says Pope Francis. Listening means paying attention, wanting to understand, to value, to respect, and to ponder what the other person says. Knowing how to listen is an immense grace, a gift which we need to ask for, and then make every effort to practice. But I would ask, which of us has the skills to listen to people who are different to ourselves? The person from another culture, the person who is deaf or blind, the person who struggles with the spoken word, the gypsy, the refugee, or the migrant. Who amongst us has trouble to acquire these skills? Is the quality of listening a measure of our compassion? So this brings me to the second part of my talk, which involves some personal reminiscences about my Catholic education in the 60s and the extraordinary changes taking place in the Church and in post-war Britain. In 1962, in Pope John XXIII's opening address to the Second Vatican Council, he said Vatican II was to be the beginning of a new day, not its climax. He said that the Church has always opposed errors regarding the faith, traditionally responding to such errors with the greatest severity, but that nowadays the Church prefers to make use of the medicine of mercy. That same year, I was in the sixth form at school, preparing for university entrance 2 years later. The school I was at was Oxford High School in Sheffield, and the sisters seemed very taken with the Pope's pronouncements and what they saw as the implications for Catholic women. Well, in recent months, one of the most popular television series in the United Kingdom has been called The Midwife. I don't know whether it's here yet. It's based on the diaries of the midwife from that period. The programmes follow the changes taking place in post-war Britain, as seen through the eyes of a community of nuns running a maternity hospital in the East End of London and their young women staff. And in recent episodes, we've reached those same early 60s, and the medicine of mercy is being shared prodigiously. In one episode, an unmarried mum, a teacher, lost her board and lodging and her job when her nosy landlady discovered the scandal of her early pregnancy. The nuns offered her some practical help, but realised that they had not offered her enough comfort because of their own judgmental attitudes. She felt so deserted by everyone that she attempted a brutal abortion on her own. One of the nuns then befriended her and supported her back to health. The nun showed mercy, or if you like, compassion. The programme, called The Midwife, also shows how the opportunities and expectations for women were changing. When I left my grammar school, very few girls actually went to university, and the majority of more academically able girls went to a Catholic teacher training college. I took what today is called a gap year before going to university, and I was posted to Eastern Nigeria by voluntary service overseas, a new programme for school leavers. It was just before the Biafran War. I taught science in a girls' school hidden deep in the rainforest. I grew up that year. In the company of an American Peace Corps volunteer, and with some encouragement from the Nigerian nun headmistress and a local Irish missionary priest, I became an observer of another culture and of how Catholic culture was lived in an African community. If you like, I learned to listen in a different way. This is all relevant to my later career in medicine, where my Catholic upbringing and education had only partly prepared me for life as a doctor and as a working mother. that my immersion in another culture had helpfully challenged many of my childhood assumptions and emboldened me to make friends and develop interests outside of my university peers, which is how I met my husband Martin, also a returned volunteer, and we married in 1969 when I was still a student. Now, our son Nigel was a cause of some worry to us. He developed rather slowly and was often frustrated. By the age of 9, he could only put 2 words together. He was lovable, curious, unable to communicate. Now in his 40s, he still struggles with spoken communication. We learned the hard way that we were the experts on our child. Martin and I wrote a book for other parents about our experience and the experience of friends and acquaintances with their disabled children. Nigel, my son, showed me that listening was a skill to be practiced at all hours of the day and night, that listening was rarely done with words. We learned that visual literacy was as important as word literacy, and that wordless ways of communicating were fun too. Well, disability is no stranger to my family. My father had been a D-Day veteran, my son had an intellectual disability, and then in 2005 my youngest daughter was stabbed in the neck by a stranger and paralysed. In the days that followed, we were on the receiving end of compassion and mercy. We were in need of comfort. People attended to our day-to-day physical needs. Meals would appear on our doorstep. Drivers to take us to and from the hospital. I wrote a piece in the Tablet, which the editor titled Blessings and Abundance, in which I struggled with the miracle of her survival and notions of mercy. And by survival, I mean the survival of her spirit, her faith, as well as bodily survival, despite being unable to speak. We learned to go through the alphabet letter by letter and wait for her to blink in response to the one she wanted to spell. We knew she was all right when she dictated a haiku to her father by blinking the letters to him. It said, "Still silent body, but within my spirit sings, dancing in love light." I share her second poem, written after her 18-month-old son was allowed to visit her in intensive care. Cherished, chubby hands, tenderly stroking my face, bless me once again. This brings me to the third and final part of my talk. There's been quite a bit of it, I'm afraid. What I was inspired to do and some of my current responsibilities. And I want to ask you a question. If I asked you whether you gain deeper intellectual and emotional meaning from a work of visual art than a piece of literature, the majority of you would recognise a stronger visual preference. If I was to ask you to check with your neighbour what you saw in this picture, I don't think we do have time for it, you would all see different things. There isn't a script for this picture. Okay? You can look at it now and perhaps talk about it later, but different ones, different members of the audience will see different things. So after working as a GP and training as a child psychiatrist and psychotherapist, I began to specialise with intellectually disabled children and adults, and I increasingly discovered how vulnerable they were to abuse and neglect, and this became my life's work. My experience as Nigel's mum had led me into storytelling and pictures. As a child, we'd used cartoon strips to prepare Nigel for an adventure that we were planning for him. I still do this today. This is his timetable for next week. I've had to do his timetables for him with the photographs of who's going to be with him, when he's getting the train, what he's doing each day, for all of the days that we're away. As time went on, I started to use pictures to communicate with my patients, and primarily as a tool to help me tell their own stories. I was using pictures to listen to them. Picture books were a bit of a hobby, but also a clinical teaching and research tool. The name of the series I co-created with my patients, Beyond Words, explains quite a lot because the books are looking for deeper meaning in people's life experiences. And there are wordless books for people who find pictures easier than words. Most are adult stories addressing what I long ago called the 3 secrets dependency, and sexuality. 3 secrets traditionally kept from people with intellectual disabilities. The theoretical basis is not made explicit to the reader, or even those who co-create them with me, people who themselves have disabilities. The essential ingredients are respect, honesty, and the search for meaning in everyday relationships, barriers to opportunity, and perhaps most importantly, hope. And on a recent American tour, an Anglican vicar described my work as being based in a theology of hope. But they are deceptively simple. A great deal of psychoanalytic thought goes into the creation of each story. Each book involves 18 months of research and trialling in its development. Now, wordless books have been used to support children with special educational needs since the 1980s, and more recently their benefits for all children and young people has been recognised, including those whose first language is not English. Locker, in 2015 at the University of Iowa, wrote, "Wordless books are the great unifier of many audiences. Wordless books allow the reader to leap over decoding into higher order thinking." Books beyond words enable readers to create their own interpretation of the picture, the story, and to bring to the story their own life experiences and feelings. And Bear, in 2005, wrote, "This seeing beyond is what may allow the reader to enter the world beyond, suspending reality for that time that he or she is engaged." Let me give an example. Maureen was a patient of mine. Her father died, and some months later, her brother asked for help. He said that Maureen seemed very slowed down. Her personal hygiene had deteriorated. He didn't know why. Reading When Dad Died with Maureen got her talking about her dad. She hadn't been to his funeral because her brother thought that would be best. Maureen wanted to know what happened when someone died. She asked if heaven was near Balham. She'd been there with her dad once. She talked about the things they did together and how much she missed him. After 3 or 4 meetings, she asked if she could keep the book, and I didn't see her for over a year. But when she returned, she gave me the dog-eared book back, in case someone else needed it. She said no one else talked to her about her dad, and reading the book reminded her of our chats. She said she didn't need the book anymore because she'd taken his photo out of the drawer, where she'd hidden it after he died, and that helped her to remember him now. Theo was 14 when I first met her. She attended a residential school for children with autism and had returned from the holidays in a very distressed state, reluctant to participate in activities she previously enjoyed. She was mute. I saw her for many months, during which time she gradually started talking again in her everyday life, but she never spoke to me. We worked creatively with drawings, and every session included some time looking at the book called Jenny Speaks Out. She chose 4 pictures in the book. This is one of them. And these were the only ones she looked at week by week. She chose the one that most reflected her mood and her focus, from being scared and lonely, through anger, to disclosing that a man had told her not to tell anyone what had happened. She ended with a picture of Jenny in the story sitting comfortably chatting with an older woman. And the last time we met, this was the only picture she wanted to look at. Her message was clear. I ran a weekly psychotherapy group for about 18 years with psychoanalyst Dr. Valerie Simerson, and we welcomed people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who were victims of sexual, physical and emotional trauma. At the beginning, all the members were men who were referred as perpetrators of abuse. All had been sexually abused in childhood, but their own childhood trauma had not been addressed. We began our work by working with the victim in each one of them, showing them empathy, and gradually enabling them to have empathy for the other members of the group. We read books beyond words in the group, passing a book around so that the members could say what each picture meant to them. It was painstakingly slow work. One member stayed for 10 years. He, that particular man, will always need secure care. but his own relationships with staff and other residents in his residential home are safer and happier ones, and he's no longer on large doses of medication. Well, now, the books are read not just in therapeutic settings, but in book clubs in libraries. And I find that very particularly encouraging and exciting that people can sit together in a public community setting to share aspects of life which are challenging, rewarding, encouraging. Our books aren't all about abuse and death. There are books about falling in love, books about exercise, books about food and so on. But they're stories, and people are coming together to read a story that they actually can access because there are no words that get in the way. Here are some members of a book club in Kent. Kent County now has 15 different library book clubs, which is wonderful. Well, 4 children and 4 grandchildren later, I find myself engaged in some rather extraordinary leadership positions, the House of Lords, the British Medical Association, and other positions. The Pontifical Commission is perhaps the least expected and the most challenging. Our task is about opening hearts and minds to the long-term horror that any and all abuse of power does to the developing psyche. One big problem is that individuals, families and organisations think it could never happen here. And to face up to this global human tragedy, we all need to understand the power of listening. The Commission needs the life experiences, the knowledge and skills that different members bring from around the world. The Holy Father has asked us to recommend policies and educational programmes to safeguard children and vulnerable adults, and to respond compassionately and effectively to victim survivors of abuse, to enable their better healing and care. We have to advise on the formation of priests and religious, and on the identification and treatment of perpetrators. People need to be heard before they can learn to listen. Most of all, ongoing mercy and compassion is essential for those who've been hurt, who need and deserve a long-term commitment to their healing and care. Those who are charged with listening to victim survivors need mercy. Family members, teachers, doctors and therapists. The listening isn't a one-off. It's continuous. Abuse never becomes historical for the victim. For many, it's there every morning when they wake up. And empathy is needed for those who did harm to someone more vulnerable than himself or herself. Recognising that the perpetrator has almost certainly been a victim themselves, they need to be heard too. In her book, Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom tells how she showed mercy to a former Nazi prison guard. She was struggling to shake the guard's offered hand. She realised that she could not forgive him in her own strength, but she prayed to God to forgive him. I've read this book. It is a profoundly moving story of somebody who was in a concentration camp and who was there with her sister, and was there when her sister died. His father died, and other family members died. One of the most extraordinary things in the story is the way in which Corrie and her sister pray with the other people living there to try to give them hope. She showed for herself that ultimately God is a source of the mercy we need, both for ourselves and to enable us to be merciful to others. The people that I've worked with in my life, whether I've worked with them because they've been grieving, because they've been abused, because of depression, because of misunderstanding, because they've been admitted to hospital, when they should have been able to stay in their own home to live an ordinary life. They're ordinary human beings, just like you and me. And they're people who need friendship, patience, time, compassion, and perhaps mercy. So I'm going to end my talk by remembering the power of friendship, and hope that we may be able to have some dialogue now with some questions.